which of these manga is better? Fans of Soul Eater have long questioned whether Ohkubo's second series, Fire Force, is actually the better story. You would think it's better since he had more experience when writing Fire Force, and the writing and art are certainly better in a lot of ways. But ask hardcore fans and they'll tell you that Soul Eater is still the better series. Now, I myself am not a long-time fan. I only just finished binging both series back to back. So having done so, I'd like to examine the strengths and weaknesses of both series, discuss how they both influence each other, and figure out whether Soul Eater or Fire Force is the better series. Now, some of you might point out that I said manga in the beginning of the video, and while I certainly think it's important to consider each anime for these series, I think the anime kinda just comes down to preference. Soul Eater already has the advantage of nostalgia, but it really comes down to two things. First, do you like older anime? Older anime generally just... Oh, and I know I'm touching some nerves by calling Soul Eater an older anime, but just stick with me. Older anime usually just have a different vibe than some of the newer stuff. So if you like older anime, then you'll probably like Soul Eater better. The other thing I would mention is just the respective studios. So if you like Studio Bones better, then you'll probably like Soul Eater better. If you're cultured and love Dave Pro, then odds are you might like Fire Force better. Like I said, it's more of a preference thing. But those are the anime. For this video, we're mainly concerned with the source material. And on a similar note, I'd actually like to start by sharing an important disclaimer. Namely that this is a bit of an unfair comparison to begin with because Soul Eater and Fire Force have two different styles. Ohkubo went into each of them with two different end goals in mind. So for example, this is kinda like deciding whether deep dish or New York style pizza is better. Of course, they share a lot in common and in some cases might even come from the same restaurant. But at the end of the day, bias and preference are going to play a huge part in that decision. That being said, I do think we can reach some common ground. The truth of the matter is that each series does something that a lot of people agree is better. Now, in my experience, one of those things is plot. After reading all of Soul Eater, I can say without a doubt that Fire Force has a plot that is clearly better. I will start by saying that Soul Eater's plot does have one advantage though. Actually, before I do that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, where I like Soul Eater better is in the beginning. In the case of the anime, and then again when I started the manga, Fire Force was a bit slow in the first few arcs. Meanwhile, Soul Eater is like page 1 and boom, you're addicted. Like the way Ohkubo structures that whole Medusa arc is amazing. And I would even go so far as to argue that it's one of the best first arcs, sagas, whatever, in manga. It doesn't drag on, there's a bunch of payoff, and everything just clicks by the time you get to those fights. In the case of Fire Force, you do have good arcs early on like Asakusa, and then the arc where they go underground, but it takes a while to get there. But this is where Fire Force has the advantage. Whereas Fire Force is a slow burn in the beginning, it never slows down and in fact, gets exponentially better as the story goes on. And this is because, as anyone who reads the story can tell you, this story was carefully planned out from beginning to end. Soul Eater, on the other hand, not so much. Like I said before, the pacing after that first arc is kinda bonkers and definitely has its ups and downs. And whereas I feel like everything was deliberate in Fire Force, there's a fair share of stuff in Soul Eater where I was low-key just like, what are we even doing here? Not often, but often enough to make a difference. I also think Ohkubo does a much better job of adding depth to the overall narrative in Fire Force. For example, the world building in Fire Force is amazing. You have the intersection of corporations, government, and religion. You have the way that influences the people in their day-to-day lives. You have the people who reject this way of living, the people who are marginalized or outright rejected by this kind of society. Ohkubo makes a deeply layered world and explores it as much as he can from top to bottom and everywhere in between. Meanwhile, in Soul Eater, there is plenty of world building, but anyone will tell you it doesn't come close to Fire Force's. I will admit that I really like the madness in Soul Eater. I think it's one of my favorite ways to explore the ideas of how people can break down into anxiety and depression. and how it leads to all kinds of moral ambiguity. But that alone isn't necessarily enough to give Soul Eater a clear advantage over Fire Force. But where there isn't such a clear advantage is in regard to art in both series. Now this is deserving in a video of its own, but basically here's how I would break things down. Fire Force has more detailed backgrounds and an art style that is much more consistent. Soul Eater has crazier looking backgrounds, crazier looking character designs, but its art style goes through a lot more changes. Obviously, this is a gross oversimplification, but that's how I would say it breaks down. And hopefully you can tell that neither of those is objectively better than the other. In regards to art, I think this is where preference plays the biggest factor. If you ask me though, I like the art in Soul Eater better. I like the way Ohkubo bends the perspective and backgrounds in Soul Eater, something he doesn't do nearly as much in Fire Force. I also like the crazier character designs of Soul Eater better. But again, that's a preference thing. And I hope you weren't waiting for me to transition into an even more objective part of the video, because oh boy, am I going to piss some people off here. Okay, so now let's talk about fights. Fights are probably where I'm stuck the most. Because on the one hand, fights in Fire Force are insane. I mean, I can just mention Arthur vs. Dragon and everyone knows exactly what I'm talking about. But even then, there's so many other great fights. You have the Joker and Benny team-up, you have Shinra vs. Burns, Shinra vs. Kurono. Oh my god, you have Hinoa vs. Arrow, another amazing fight. I mean, this dude was ripping off blown-up rifle barrels and replacing them with new ones like they were Nerf guns. There's so many good fights in Fire Force. And then you get to Soul Eater. Now, Soul Eater also has a ton of great fights. I can name a bunch, like Stein vs. Medusa, Kid vs. Mosquito, and, of course, Black Star vs. Mifune, which, weeks after my read-through, I still think is the best fight between both series. But when I compare Soul Eater to Fire Force, it seems like Fire Force has more great fights on average, whereas in Soul Eater, there's a bunch of them, but there's also a lot of other fights that are pretty good, but not as great. But at the same time, the fights that are really good in Soul Eater are arguably better than some of Fire Force's best fights. So that's kinda where I'm at. It seems like Fire Force has more great fights. But at the same time, there's this question of which series reaches higher peaks. And I think this line of thinking also comes into play when we look at arguably the most important part of this discussion: characters. In almost the exact same kind of conversation, I think it's this thing where Fire Force has more great characters, and Soul Eater has more characters that are just sort of okay. But the characters that are great in Soul Eater are freaking incredible. I was having this conversation the other night actually, but let's take, say, Black Star. Is he categorically better than every single character in Fire Force? Probably not. But one-on-one, he's probably better than most characters. In other words, maybe he's not better than every character in Fire Force, but more often than not, if you compare Black Star to Maki, or Black Star to Obi, or Black Star to Ogun, 9 times out of 10 you're probably going to like Black Star better. This is true for a lot of the characters in Soul Eater, and here's why I think that is. In Fire Force, Ohkubo takes the time to flesh everyone out at least a little bit. Obviously some characters more than others, but generally everyone gets something. But then you'll get characters like Maki, for example, who have one arc where we get a proper deep dive into their character, and then that's kind of it. And that's Maki, one of the most popular characters in the series. And this is the case for a lot of popular characters in Fire Force, minus the few exceptions like Shinra, Arthur, or Benny. Meanwhile, in Soul Eater, there are a bunch of characters with broad character arcs that develop well along the entire course of the story. You have Soul's development through the story as he balances his 2 conflicting personas. You have Black Star's struggle to achieve his own ideals. You have Stein's arc where he repeatedly has to battle against his own madness. You have Krona and their back and forth character arc. Now, don't get me wrong, this certainly isn't the case for all of the characters. But this is kind of what I'm getting at when we talk about the writing, the art, the fights, the characters. Every time I look back on my journey, every time I think about all of the insane shit Ohkubo pulled off in Fire Force and how it has every right to be the better story, I'm just like, yeah, but Soul Eater though. And to come back to our food example, I think it's kind of like this. Say Fire Force is your typical restaurant that has a great atmosphere, great service, and a great menu with something for everyone on it. Salads, fish, steaks, desserts, you name it. And then this new place Soul Eater comes to town, and they're like, hey, what's up? We got chicken and we got rice. And I'm not talking chicken and rice like that whack stuff the bodybuilders force feed themselves. I'm talking good home-style chicken with that good sauce like mom used to make. And the kind of rice that's so simple but so good that you want to eat one bowl after another. I think Fire Force does more things consistently than Soul Eater. Writing, characters, art, whatever. On paper, it should be better because it has everything, and I mean everything you want in a story. But even though Soul Eater might not do as much as Fire Force, it still crushes Fire Force in that smaller menu of things it does well. Nostalgia obviously comes into play, but at the end of the day, while Fire Force might be a more organized story with more payoff in the end and more consistent art, Soul Eater just reaches higher peaks and is much more iconic because of the wacky characters. But those wacky characters also have very real problems that are fleshed out very well. The bottom line is, I just resonate with Soul Eater more than I do with Fire Force. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you compare the two series? Which one do you like better? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my previous video on Fire Force. In that video, I talk about the current state of the Fire Force series. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.